Section 1 of Early Adventures of Don Everhard by Gordon Young. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Ben Tucker. A Royal Flush of Hearts. I knew as soon as he sat in the game that he was playing for more than the money represented in his stack of chips. He had the face of one whose ancestors hadn't worked in their shirt sleeves for many generations, but it had a worn, desperate, tense expression. Even then, his face looked youthful. He wasn't more than 23 or 24. They were not all thoroughbreds who came to Johnny Blix's snug little apartment, but most of them had money. I got a good deal of it. Johnny thought he was indebted to me for certain minor favors in the past which he appreciated far more than I thought they were worth. He knew that poker was more than a science with me. It was an art. The sandpapered tips of my fingers were almost like eyes, and I could feel and understand faint indentations on the cards that not many people could have discovered without a strong magnifying glass. Johnny was a square gambler, as square as professional gamblers ever are, and any stranger really got a run for his money on his roulette table, though, of course, if the luck got to breaking too hard against the house, Johnny would press a little button with his toe, and that made it very hard for the lucky man to put his money on the color or number that won. Nor did I play poker for my health. I wasn't hoggish about winning, and didn't attract attention to my consistent luck, but with the minimum of effort and some enjoyment, I managed to have an income somewhat above the demands I made on it. It wasn't every night or every week that I marked or held out cards. I knew and could practice about every trick that was ever devised to make the other fellow lose at poker, and many of them were what is called ethical. In poker, as in law, there are certain rules laid down by which you can cheat the other fellow. Some men use their face as a mirror and reflect into it the quality of the hands they hold. The young aristocrat was not one of these. He was inscrutable as an Oriental. He played his cards well, but desperately. I went after him. I liked him, but I was determined to break him. I knew from the way he was playing that there was something back of the game, and I was interested. Some people go to the movies for their excitement and amusement. I like to take mine off the streets and hot from the hearts of people who are living tragedies. Into some of these little dramatic episodes I now and then force myself as a super. Every time the boys stayed in a pot where I happened to have an interest, I boosted. I didn't win them all, or didn't get a winning percentage, but that was an incident. I wanted to make him lose. It was a stiff game, a big game even for Johnny's, where the stakes were always high. I've seen honest men win up into 4 figures between sunset and dawn, and sometimes they did it in spite of all I could do. Even a gambler who uses art instead of science can't dictate to luck. He can only increase his percentage or chance of winning. It's different in roulette. Under a properly constructed wheel, there is a delicate mechanism that arbitrarily puts the ball into the color that the man who has his toe on the button wants. The boy was playing with good nerve, too. He played hard. He plunged and he bluffed, and twice he caught me with a good hand, but not good enough, and materially reduced the number of blue chips before me. Then I went after him in earnest. I stowed 4 tens in my pocket and waited. I could palm half a deck in either hand, and nobody would ever spot it with a casual look. So I had no trouble in switching those tens to my hand when he boosted the pot high as a house and stood pat. I drew 2 cards. It was a mere detail to get rid of the extra one before the showdown, and he stood pat. He figured that he had me beaten and calculated to give me another severe trimming. But his house full on aces wasn't worth the paper it took to print the cards. That gave him a hard jolt. I put 3 kings and a pair of deuces into my pocket and waited. Soon I caught him again, this time with a flush, and I knew that he had gone just about to the bottom of his pile. I boosted it so high the next time he stayed that he came in only for a showdown, and we both lost. But I had broken him. That was what I wanted. He didn't say a word. He just sat there for a minute looking rather dazed, bit his lips, sighed, and got up. I cashed in and followed him out of the room. He looked around, recognized me, and said nervously, "Did you have it in for me? You played like it." I looked at him steadily, and with just a touch of sympathy in my tone, I asked if it really meant much to him to lose. "Meant much? Meant much? My God!" He fairly shouted. His nerves were that unstrung. "It meant everything! I simply had to win!" With a gulp of despair and a sudden relaxation of his body, he added, "And I didn't." "What are you going to do? Bump yourself off?" I asked a bit coldly. "No. Bump somebody else off." He meant it, too. "That's all right if you can get away with it," I said indifferently. But the law says if you knock out a man's tooth, you have to give up an eye. Law, he sneered. Then, by the contrast of the ugly expression, I became aware that he was handsome and unsophisticated. Some boys have hard faces at 10 and wear a perpetual sneer, and have seen and known things that make the sneer fitting. He was not such at past 20. I raised my eyebrows quizzically, and he answered, "You can kill a snake and it's all right, but if you kill a reptilian man, it's the electric chair for you. Such a law." Some people who knew something about me might have thought it passing strange had they heard me holding forth on the merits of the law and explaining how if the activities of the reptilian man were called to its attention, the law would move toward him majestically, with the menacing sword of justice ready to strike. "Yes," he retorted scornfully, "and put into the papers the very thing I would pay any price to keep out." After that, it was easy to get him to talk. We went to a quiet saloon and sat down. He was young enough to look askance at my glass of ginger ale, preferring a little neat brandy himself, tossing it down as men in trouble do when most in need of a cold instead of a hot brain. It made me impatient to hear him talking about his life being ruined if his parents found out the girl had a secret past, and that if her blackmailer wasn't bought off, he might as well kill the fellow and then shoot himself. When I think of all the good courage that people waste in killing themselves, I come near to losing the laboriously acquired poise and calmness I have solicitously developed for nearly 20 years. And when I hear young, healthy men talking about life being ruined because something interferes with the paternal pocketbook, I do lose it. But when I hear of a man or woman rubbing their bellies on the ground before a blackmailer, I get angry and show it. Blackmailers simply capitalize cowardice as bankers capitalize confidence. A blackmailer can't last any longer without people afraid of him than a banker can if people are afraid of him. The best way to deal with a blackmailer is to tell him to go to the devil or to the newspapers with his incriminating letters. And if he goes to the newspapers or to the girl you want to marry or to your employer, what of it? It's better to be wounded than to run away. If a community won't respect you or a girl won't love you or an employer won't have you because of some mistake in other years, well, there are other communities, other girls, and other employers. Most of all, there's yourself. I sometimes wonder how those people who have submitted to blackmail feel when they stand before a mirror. I would have left Mr. Ernest Norcross fumbling with his empty glass and gone back to Johnny Blix's, except that I thought there must be a deeper streak of honor in him than was readily perceptible if he was willing himself to trust and marry a girl who evidently had made some kind of a desperate mistake that his family and friends wouldn't overlook. All interesting women have made mistakes, but those most interesting have been clever enough to conceal them. However, when I expressed myself on the blackmailers, he told me with a good deal of fire that I didn't know of what I was talking. He was not entirely sober, and was much piqued by the parochial, lofty way in which I had spoken of disregarding blackmailing threats and facing the issue. He put up to me one of the strangest situations I've heard of, and had I had the respect for the law and conventions that corresponded with my comments on the subject when I first approached him, I would have felt it my duty as a pious, respectable citizen to protest, much less actively to take a small part in allowing him to cheat the state, the church, his friends, and be myself an accessory before and after the fact of polyandry. His parents, particularly his mother, were firm Catholics. The woman, she wasn't much more than a girl, had been married before. She had never been divorced, and didn't propose to get one, for the very act of applying for it would destroy the secrecy she had laboriously constructed almost from the day of her marriage when she found that her husband was an unconscionable blackguard. She had never intended to marry, but Norcross had met her and wooed her and won her heart. She tried to put him aside, saying it was impossible. He had pressed her for an explanation. She had confided to him the truth, and he recklessly but earnestly said he didn't care a blank, that he loved and wanted her. So bitterly humiliated and ashamed had she been of her mistake, a mistake made impulsively while at a small mining camp in Colorado, that she had bribed the clerk to destroy the page of the register. But the marriage certificate remained. It was in the hands of one Tobias E. Finley, her husband. She had paid monthly toll to him almost ever since, though when she destroyed the page of the register, she had also planned to buy the certificate outright and so eliminate all evidence and try to forget the wretched experience. But Finley had refused to surrender such an income-producing document, except for an amount far too exorbitant for her to consider. She loved Norcross, and against the wishes of her heart tried to persuade him that marriage would be impossible. Even if she could get a divorce, his parents would set their faces against her, and perhaps against him. But he said a divorce was useless, that she wasn't the wife of Finley any more than if she had never seen him, and that he wasn't going to allow a legal technicality to keep him from the woman he loved. Then he made a mistake. He went to Finley and tried to negotiate for the certificate. The astute rascal instantly saw possibilities for an increased income. He not only raised his originally prohibitive price for the certificate, but frightened Norcross into believing that if he too did not begin at once contributing regularly, that he would make the certificate public. I was confident as soon as Norcross told me that so cunning a crook would not be in haste to kill the goose that laid his golden eggs. But Norcross was young, inexperienced, and made the error of hastening to meet Finlay's demand. Since that hour he had constantly beset and tormented the boy for money. "I simply have to have it," he said with a gesture of helplessness. "My father is now suspicious because I've gone through so much more than my allowance. I thought I could win it. I've been playing at the Bristol. That's Finley's hangout. He gambles there all the time, but a fellow there took a liking to me, one of the housemen, I think, told me to try Johnny Blix's, said I could get a square deal there." "Finley suggested that you play poker for it?" "Yes." "Probably gets a commission on what you lose there and sees that you never have a chance to win. How much does he have to have tomorrow morning?" He told me. I was surprised at the nerve of the scoundrel. Inside of a month he had made the boy dig up something over $5,000, and that didn't include another $1,500 that he had dropped playing poker in an effort to raise funds. No wonder his father was growing suspicious. "How do you know he has the certificate?" "I'm not that green. I made him show it to me. He keeps it in a safe at the Bristol." Sometimes my mind works with amazing rapidity. I deserve no credit for so-called rapid thinking. It is done automatically. Almost in an instant I had considered the feasibility of getting the Bristol raided, of holding it up. I have done things as desperate for no more cause, of kidnapping Finley and making the certificate the ransom price. But the aftermath to each of these was likely to be embarrassing. However, I had hit upon a plan that could be tried and would be harmless if it failed, in which case something else might be done. It is not exactly natural in me to be suspicious, but I have cultivated suspicion until it has become instinctive. I had no reason for not thinking the girl was all right, but it was just as well to make sure. I told Norcross that if he could arrange for me to meet her, I would try to get the certificate away from Finley. "I'll pay you anything if you give me time." He grasped at my offer of assistance as a falling man grasps at a spider's web. "We'll discuss my fee after I see Miss Rankin." "But I can't pay him that $1,000 tomorrow." "Tell him not to get excited, that you're doing some planning to get the lump sum he asked." "But that's impossible." "I know it. He doesn't. He knows your father, or knows who he is." "That's it. He says if I don't pay up regularly, that he'll go to father." "It's a very small detail, perhaps, but I like to see that the boy didn't call his father the old man." "He won't be in a hurry to go to your father. You tell him, Finley, that you have explained the situation to a friend and he is trying to help you out, but that Finley will have to part with the certificate, sell out for a lump sum." "You wouldn't trust me?" "No, not even if I had that much money. But the fact that he keeps it stowed in the safe of William Bristol's palatial gambling joint has given me an inspiration. Poker players and diplomats have to use their heads. Most people simply use a checking account. You say this houseman that tipped you off that Johnny Blix's was a square joint took a liking to you?" "Yes." "I knew that Johnny, as does every gambler doing business under police protection, kept ringers scattered through the rival joints to tip players off that such and such a place is a square house. But Johnny had that reputation. Did this fellow seem thick with Finley?" "I should say not. Every time they got into the same game, they bucked each other, just like you did me." "What's his name?" "Watson?" I told him to wait a minute and go into the telephone. I called up Johnny and asked him if he knew a fellow named Watson that loafed around the Bristol. Johnny said that he did. I asked if he was all right, and the answer was satisfactory. I didn't ask if Watson was a ringer. That was none of my business. But I did ask Johnny if he would get in touch with Watson and say to him that I am a friend of yours and that he can go to the limit with me. That I am okay. Johnny said he would do it right away. I coached the boy a little more in what to tell Finley the next morning, and he promised to introduce me to Miss Rankin in the afternoon. Then we parted, but first he pressed my hand, and without being maudlin, said a lot of things he probably wouldn't have said if he had drank ginger ale instead of 2 or 3 glasses of brandy. But he was young and he was grateful, believing that I was actually snatching him from what looked but a moment before to be a wretched, inextricable predicament. I had an appointment with Watson the next morning, and we talked matters over. He knew that I wanted to get something belonging to Finley out of the safe, to get it so I could keep it and be open about it. But I didn't say what it was. He agreed to do as I suggested. The fact that extremely high stakes were the rule at the Bristol, it being a more pretentious joint than Johnny's, made him think as I did. That is, that it would help some in getting Findlay into the game. In the afternoon, Norcross took me to meet Miss Rankin. She lived with an older married sister, and they were obviously refined, comfortably wealthy, attractive people. With my first glance at her, I understood why the boy wanted to marry her, though she did have a husband, and whether or not she got a divorce. I sympathized with him, too. There was no question of her being dishonest, even if she was going to marry again without that divorce. A lot of crooked people go through life scrupulously keeping technically honest, and a lot of honest people have the misfortune to be technically at counter with the law. Of course, I consider that her real mistake started in not openly getting a divorce from Findlay as soon as she found out what he was, but having set her heart on secrecy and worked for it, she had come to feel that death even would be better, and certainly less shameful, than to have the sordid scandal exposed. Her family position was such that the newspapers would have had a great time for a few days. Miss Rankin plainly showed alarm when Norcross told her that I was going to help them and knew everything. She caught her breath and bit her knuckles, looking at me apprehensively with startled wide eyes. Brown eyes, they were. A more beautiful woman I have seldom seen. There are many who have perfect features, charming gowns, an abundance of wonderful hair, a graceful body, just as she had. But there are few so young as she who have had their emotions so strongly stirred, in whose heart the fires of tragedy have glowed without flaming up devastatingly. After all, it is only those people whose characters are without reproach and who have suffered that are beautiful. Any artist of quality will tell you that, just as one first called my attention to it. Miss Rankin showed, however, her nervousness, and the stress of especially the past few weeks had marked but far from marred her face. She would be more beautiful, I knew, as soon as Watson and I, who were taking the role of gravediggers, had thrown the last shovelful upon her past. I told her I did not inquire from curiosity, but because I wanted to make sure that every possibility of Findlay's getting any other evidence to replace his precious certificate had been eliminated, and asked her to tell in detail just how the marriage came about and all that she had done to conceal it. "It was 5 years ago," she said. "I was only 18, and unfortunately I was intensely romantic. I was with my father out west on a trip. He was interested in mines and was unexpectedly called up to some camp far from the railroad. He didn't think it best for me to make the trip and left me at the hotel. I met Mr. Findlay. I had met him before Father left, but being lonely, I then saw a good deal of him. He swept me off my feet. He made me think he was wonderful, and spoke as though he were a man of affairs, and so skillfully and subtly conveyed to me that he was a real gentleman, that I foolishly married him one afternoon. But at 12 o'clock, noon, that is, I hadn't expected to. We were walking back to the hotel, and he was telling me how pleased Father would be. Just imagine, and I was silly enough not only to listen to him, but to believe him. We were walking back to the hotel when suddenly he stopped and stood staring a moment at a man across the street. I knew something was wrong from the way he acted, and was greatly frightened, asking him what was the matter. He said, "It's all right, kid, I'll explain later, don't believe anything you hear," and he left me. He ran. I shuddered. The way he said kid, I wasn't too frightened to notice that. The man across the street came over to me and asked, "Wasn't that Toby Findlay?" I said it was. He looked at me appraisingly and said, "I guess you're all right, but you're in bad company, little girl." I begged him to tell me what was the matter, and he did. He was a detective from Denver. He was after Findlay for some kind of robbery. He showed me the warrant, and that made me remember that Findlay had my marriage certificate in his pocket. I was sick with fear and shame. I thought when they caught Findlay they would learn I was his wife, but they didn't. He had a chance to hide it first and get into another camp. He never told that we were married. I thought he did it to protect me and admired him for it. I spent a miserable week before Father returned, and I was in torment as to whether or not to tell him. Father was very stern. I know now that the reason Findlay went to the penitentiary without telling anyone that I was his wife, and he wrote me asking that I say nothing about it, as though I were anxious to, was that he knew Father wouldn't waste any time in getting a divorce for me. And he wanted a hold on me when he came out of prison. He was sent to prison for 2 years. Father died about 8 months before Findlay came out. I thought the situation over and determined to wipe out every bit of evidence of that marriage. I was encouraged because I had been fortunate enough not to have anybody notice that Findlay had been recently married when they caught him. But it had been several days before the detective caught him, and then in another camp close by. When Father died, I came into some money, and I followed the plan I decided upon and went back to Colorado. I didn't tell the clerk what name on the register I was anxious to have out of it, but paid him a big price to tear out one particular page. He said himself the chances were that no one would ever discover it. I went to the justice that married us and asked if he kept a record of the people he married. He said that he kept no personal record, simply recorded the license. So, in one way or another, I made sure that I had gotten rid of every record. I couldn't, of course, find the witnesses. I remembered that they had been two people who just happened to be there. I feel satisfied that they don't even remember the marriage, and if the certificate is destroyed, their names will be lost. I wrote Finley to come to me as soon as he was out of prison and sent him the money. He tried to make me think I was his wife. I offered to pay him for the certificate and never dreamed that he could be so detestable as he was. He laughed and said I could pay him a regular monthly income and he would keep the certificate. I told him no and said I wanted it myself. His price was outrageous. It was simply unpayable. There was nothing I could do but mail him bills every month. I did have judgment enough not to send checks. Both she and Norcross were nervously eager to know what plans I had, and begged me to tell them if they might really hope that I would succeed, and he offered me a large specific fee for success. I can't tell you a thing. Along about midnight, we may know more about it. As for the fee, we'll discuss that later, after the success. I believe Miss Rankin has covered the tracks about as well as is possible, but if we get the certificate, I suggest that you send rapidly as you can some wise legal friend out to Colorado to go over the ground again and make sure. Also, he might investigate Finley's record thoroughly. Perhaps we can turn the tables and blackmail him into leaving the country. Things like that have been done before to my certain knowledge. I don't want to raise up any false hopes, but if you two can be here between 11 and perhaps 1 or 2 o'clock tonight, I might be able to bring or telephone something that will be of interest. Before I left, I had Norcross repeat just what he had told Finley that morning about expecting to raise money to buy the certificate. Evidently, Finley had believed him. Crooks have an idea that there is absolutely no bottom to the purse of a millionaire, or a millionaire's son. With Finley expecting to receive a large sum, an enormously large sum of money in cold cash, within the next 24 hours, I calculated that he would be a little more reckless than usual in the four-handed game Watson was arranging for that evening. I arrived at the Bristol promptly at 9 o'clock and was shown into a private room where sat Finley, Watson, and another party, Mr. Jones. The game had been arranged ostensibly to trim me. I was supposed to be a wealthy young man who thought he could play poker. I had notified the Bristol that I liked a game of cards, but I wanted to play for money. I wanted big stakes. I couldn't get any enjoyment out of the ordinary games. I wanted one that had no limit but the sky. In other words, I had talked like the typical easy mark with a fat roll. Mr. Watson and Mr. Jones had been delegated to trim me, and when Finley had been permitted to overhear the plan, he had insisted upon being allowed to sit in the game. He never overlooked a chance to pick up easy money. There was no need for me to go into details about the game or the money involved. Those who don't understand much about poker would find it unintelligible, and those who do would probably find it tedious. And to specify even the approximate amount of the stakes is unnecessary, for to some it might seem unbelievable, and to others it might seem insignificant. It is sufficient to say that every man at the table was an experienced gambler, and each of us regarded it as a stiff game, an exceptionally stiff game for even the Bristol. Jones and Watson were housemen, that is, they were men employed by the Bristol to sit in games and make sure that nobody got away with too much money. They could be crooked when necessary, and often thought it was. Finley was playing for himself, but counted on a kind of friendship with Jones and Watson which would permit him to cheat as much as he pleased, providing I was the only one who lost by it, and he didn't get caught. My idea was to break Finley. I was willing to lose moderately if Finley would lose heavily. This would have been practically impossible if Watson had not stood in with me. I don't believe the man ever lived who could hold his own against 3 clever, crooked gamblers. But there have been many men who, with a capable and secret partner, can beat 2 other fellows. I didn't play my game entirely with cards. As a usual thing, I don't talk much when playing. But this time I showed a mean, insolent streak, and inside of 10 minutes I had Finley's goat. That is, I had him hating me and nursing the hope to show me that he was a good player, that he didn't give away his hands on his face, that he could bluff and not get caught, that he had learned to play the game more than a month before, that he wasn't afraid of a raise and did dare to raise back, all of which things I had banteringly accused him of not doing or daring to do. Watson, with little side remarks apparently friendly enough, but shrewdly calculated to rub Finley's fur the wrong way, helped him get excited. Finley was a man superficially impressive. He was big, had the carriage of a military man, a fine straight nose, a shock of dark, slightly grayed hair, but I wouldn't have trusted him with anything I wasn't anxious to lose. Jones was a silent, cadaverous individual who played cards and did nothing else. Inside of half an hour, I complained that the light hurt my eyes and put on a pair of blue glasses. This gave me the advantage of staring at anybody's hands while they shuffled or held cards without him being able to see that my eyes were on him. I kept my eyes steadily on Finley, even while talking to Watson. With my hat pulled low and behind the blue glasses, Finley couldn't tell I was watching him, and I had no trouble in seeing him palm cards and slip them up his sleeve. Besides, he was a bit clumsy. I knew he was getting ready to make a killing, so I quietly put a few cards which I had selected into my pocket and waited. Finley was in a bad position for the good of his hands. He sat to the left of me and had Watson on his left. So when Watson and I raised each other, he was whipsawed more than once into discarding the best hand of the three. It was a no-limit game, and the boosts were strenuous. It was along toward midnight, and Finley had brought out several times a hand he had secretly picked and stowed away. But up until this particular moment, neither Watson nor I had remained, much to Finley's disgust, whenever I saw him quietly exchange the cards that had been dealt for cards that he had up his pocket, and begin betting as if the resources of Rockefeller were at his command. And he had been losing consistently, too. This time I was ready and waiting for him. Watson raised him, Jones dropped out, and I raised Watson. Finley came back with a raise that took all his chips, and he threw a roll of bills onto the table. Watson threw down his hand and withdrew from the pot. I called Finley and hit him with another raise. "That's all the ready money I have," he said. "This is a no-limit game," I sneered. "It's a wonder you didn't bring along more than car fare." He winced. I made further remarks about people who tried to play in a man-sized game with only chicken feed in their pockets. Finley asked Watson to loan him money and showed his hand on the side. Watson refused but signaled me for heaven's sake to get out while I could because I couldn't win. I wasn't in the mood to get out of the pot. Watson thought I was playing a square game. I don't let every Tom, Dick, and Harry know that I can manipulate the cards. Finley showed the hand to Jones, and he started to loan the money, but a nudge from Watson changed his mind. The psychological moment had arrived. Watson, carefully coached, asked, "Say, Toby, haven't you got any collateral around here?" Finley looked thoughtfully for a moment, studied the table, and then said to me, "I got a little piece of paper in the safe that's worth more money than has passed over this table tonight. I don't want to put it up. I won't sell it. I just want to get a little credit on it until tomorrow. I'll have plenty of money then. Of course, you have to take my word for it that it's good. But my word's good. You've made a big bluff and I want to call you. If I had the money, I'd raise." Forget it," I sneered. "Raise nothing. Go ahead. Ring in your precious document, and if it's worth anything, raise on it. I'll show you you can't bluff me with talk like that. Is it worth anything, Watson?" Watson said he didn't know what it was, but he had heard Bristol say Finley called it his gold mine. "Bring it on," I said. "I won't have to show you what it is?" he asked. "No," I jeered. "You won't have to show what it is, unless you're looking for a chance to crawfish. Besides, you're going to redeem it tomorrow, aren't you?" Watson went with a note to Bristol and came back with the document, while Finley and I sat watching each other to see that neither made a false move with his cards. Although I knew I could make any kind of false move I pleased right under his nose and he wouldn't see. He didn't play poker as a fine art. He threw the precious envelope onto the table and said, "I call you." "Call me? I thought you were going to raise." "Give me one card," I said to Jones, who was dealing. "None for me," said Finley. He was standing pat. I reached into my pocket for a cigarette case, and no one could tell that in the same hand that brought out the cigarette case were 5 cards. Very desirable cards in poker. And when I removed a cigarette and restored the case, I had just 10 cards in my hand. But when I casually pushed the deck to one side to make room for my elbows, I had laid 5 cards on top of it, and no one saw a thing out of the way. I didn't spend 2 hours every morning practicing shuffling, dealing from the bottom, palming, stacking, marking, and catching cards with the feel of my fingertips without acquiring the dexterity of a professional magician. Poker was to me as music to Paderewski, and I made my living by it and enjoyed it as an art. Ostensibly, I had drawn 1 card after making heavy bets. Everybody around the board thought I had 4 of a kind. Watson's face was a study in apprehension and disappointment. Jones never moved a muscle but sat with quiet eyes, watching and saying nothing. Finley was beside himself with excitement. He begged me to let him play his mysterious document for what he thought it was worth, promising faithfully to redeem it the next day, and emphasizing again and again the arrangements he had made to collect a large amount of money from an old debt. It was as good as gold, he assured me almost hysterically. I deliberated. I said, "But that's hardly fair to me. And if you lose, you'll say I coaxed you into it. How do I know that isn't a Chessie Chadwick bluff?" If I would only take his word. He was well known. Watson knew him. Jones knew him. Bristol knew him. He had independent means. He was good for any amount. That paper would be redeemed tomorrow. The rising of the sun wasn't any more sure than he could redeem that paper. "All right, let her go," I said recklessly. His voice was high, hysterical, as he called out, "I'll raise you 20,000. Now come in, you tin horn, you piker. Get aboard that if you dare." I will say it to my credit now, for after the showdown I couldn't claim any credit, that I never batted an eyelid. I simply reached into my pocket, drew out a checkbook, and wrote a check for $20,000, and on a bank where I didn't have 1/4 of that amount deposited. "I call," I said. Finley jumped up gleefully and spread his 5 cards face upward on the table and began raking in the pot. Wait a minute, I said. "Let's have a look." "Your 4s ain't worth a blank," he shouted. "I've got a straight flush, jack high." "Who said I had 4s? I demanded indignantly. "You drew 1 card." "Of course I drew 1 card. I needed a 9 or an ace. And I caught the ace." I spread before his astonished eyes a royal flush and hearts, the highest possible hand in poker. I wasn't taking any chances with Finley. I knew enough to steal as big a hand as the deck contained. He hadn't dared go so strong. It was a raw thing to do, but when I thought of that boy and girl sitting together anxiously waiting and watching for the ringing of the telephone, with their whole future hopes and happiness shuffling and slipping back and forth across the green cloth of the table, there was no chance too desperate for me to take. Finley crumpled into his chair and sat with open mouth and glazed eyes, staring at the hand which has but one chance in exactly 649,739 of being dealt honestly. I tore up my own check, cashed in, stuck the marriage certificate into my pocket, and stood up. Finley was crouching forward on the table, leaning on his elbows, and with face distorted was glaring at me. He knew no man would have played a 4 card, even royal flush as I had played it before the draw, without being sure that the other needed card would come up into the hand. "You stole that!" he began menacingly, but he didn't finish. I leaned over and with open palm struck him full on the mouth. Never but once before had a man called me a cheat while looking into my face. The other man was nearsighted. He apologized when I brought my face close enough for him to see it distinctly. For what does it profit me to have all the arts of a magician at cards if there is the weakness in my eyes that permits any disgruntled loser to dare accuse me of cheating? But Finley was well nigh insane. He knew well he could never redeem the fabulous amount he owed me. He felt dimly that I had bilked him of his precious income, that I had deliberately trapped him. He arose from the floor, for mine is not a gentle arm when I am angry, and in his uplifted hand a sinister bit of steel flashed as he lunged forward at me. Watson leaped up and grabbed at him, but Watson was slow. I shot from my pocket, one made specially to accommodate the rebound of a large automatic, and as I did it I was aware of the thankfulness for the thick, practically soundproof rooms of the Bristol, which, selected with a view of keeping the raiders of the district attorney's office outside in case police protection proved inadequate, would not permit the report of the gun to reach the street. Finley's arm, shattered, dropped weakly like a broken stick, and the dagger fell noiselessly onto the thick carpet. Noisy, excited men rushed in from the room outside. "Huh? What's the matter? What's the matter?" shouted William Bristol himself, terribly frightened, for gunplay was bad for his business, and a death would have caused even the friendly police to clamp on the lid. Jones quietly, as if there were not a nerve in his body, almost listlessly explained. "He pulled a knife, and Mr. Everhard stopped him. Broke his arm. Pretty shooting." Bristol looked from me to Finley and back to me. Then he began abusing Finley. I poured a few drops from the half-emptied glass of ginger ale by my place at the table onto the smoldering cloth in my pocket, and remarked to Watson that it was a shame because the suit was new. Then I interrupted Bristol. "Let me say a word or two, Mr. Bristol. This fellow Finley's an ex-con, and I don't know what all else, in addition to being a blackmailer. And quite incidentally, he doesn't even know the rudiments of poker. He seemed to think he can draw again after the showdown." I kicked the dagger away from beside the table. "And if you want to call the police," I was bluffing, but bluffing safely, "I'll swear to a complaint for assault with intent to kill against him." But I want this blackmailer to know that inside of a half hour, the little document I have here will be in the hands of the party to whom it belongs." Having said that, and listened to Bristol's protest against anybody swearing to any kind of a complaint, and to his round and satisfying abuse of Finley and apology to me for having had my life endangered in his establishment, I left. As I went out the door, Watson put his hand on my shoulder and whispered, "I take my hat off to you, Mr. Everhard. I didn't think anybody could do it." "What, shoot like that?" "No, fill a royal flush in a pot like that." I looked at him out of the corner of my eyes and smiled slightly. He understood. That's about all there was to it. I took a taxi and reached Miss Rankin's a few minutes before 1 o'clock. She and the boy were beside themselves with anxiety and were worn with waiting and hoping against hope hour after hour. They were too happy and relieved even to talk when I handed the certificate to Miss Rankin. She uplifted her face and said softly but earnestly, "Thank God it's over at last." Both thought and said they were making a bungling of thanking me. Their words didn't come fluently nor gracefully, but they were giving real thanks. I withdrew my hand from Norcross's. He had pressed it ever since I came in, and struck a match, holding it up significantly. Miss Rankin, after a puzzled glance, understood, and unfolding her marriage certificate, touched a corner of it to the tiny flame, and silently we stood watching the fire eat its way up and across the parchment, wiping out, reducing to ashes, the record of an impulsive mistake. I started to leave at once. I knew they wished to be alone in the first hour of full, complete happiness. But Norcross spoiled the dramatic effect. It is strange how few people have in their own affairs the true dramatic sense. That's why they must read novels and go to the theaters. By speaking of my fee and asking how I did it. I told him that I had had a long, earnest conversation with Finley over a green-cloth table, and after some arguing, he had begged me to let him bet the certificate against a few dollars that he could pick out a better poker hand than I could. "And you remember," I said, "that as a usual thing I hold pretty good poker hands." And though he had first choice, he didn't seem to know the value of cards. A slip quite apt to prove costly, you know. "And as for a fee, supposing you send me postcards from every place you stop while on your honeymoon." So it is that among my few cherished trinkets I have a large bundle of colored postcards from various cities in Europe, and particularly from those in Italy. And tied up with these cards is a wedding invitation, the only one I ever received to the formal wedding of a millionaire. And I think just as much of it as if I had attended. But as a little present, I sent to the bride a specially designed clasp pin of enamel, a royal flush of hearts. End of section 1. Section 2 of The Early Adventures of Don Everhard by Gordon Young. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Bogus Gems. 1. I heard a noise at the door and sat quietly. I recognized it as the faint sound of sensitive fingers trying a skeleton key. The room was dark, and it was one of the so-called wee small hours, when even those with uneasy consciences are supposed to be asleep, and when, as if to establish a compensating ratio, even the faintest of noises, the little creaks and rustles that are scarcely audible in daylight, are as noticeable to a listener as the clatter of bronze. Not having much humor, I did not call out an invitation to come in. Besides, the person in the hall seemed already determined on that. As I was not in bed, but had dozingly remained on the chaise lounge when I turned out the reading lamp by my side, I saw no reason at all for disturbing my visitor's entrance. I was not surprised that someone, uninvited and at such an hour, should try to come. Not that I'd been waiting for such a one. Not at all. It would have taken more to keep me awake than the fear that somebody might steal the black jewel casket from off my table. Sleep does not come easily to me, nor remain long. I was in pajamas, with a blanket thrown over my legs, and I had, with a great show of patience, been offering myself to what the poets call Morpheus. I do not want anybody to think that worry or anything of the sort kept the bewitching kindness of sleep from my eyes, nor am I a sufferer from insomnia. I don't sleep much, that's all. I am not a sufferer from anything unless it be the meddlesomeness of people who misjudge me. One of those who were misjudging me seemed to be at the door then, trying the unresisting lock. 2. Perhaps I would do well to pause and say a word about the casket. It did not belong to me, but I had as good a right to it as the man I took it from. His name was Blackstone. He was a newcomer to San Francisco, but the police of very few, if any, cities knew about him. Not that he was clever. No, he was handsome, or not handsome exactly, but he had much about him that fascinated women. He was skillful at compromising women, then heartless in making them pay. So he had a good income, money in the bank, and posed as a gentleman. It was very foolish of him to come to me, though he did not know that I knew all about how he had tried to get me into trouble a year before in New York. He was two-faced and treacherous, as men who fascinate women usually are. Among the things he had said was that the man who killed me would never be brought to trial, which may possibly be true. When one has the undeservedly notorious reputation of gambler and gunman such as mine, the law is not likely to be very excited over the way he meets death. Blackstone had gone so far as to say that someday he was going to get me. A man who has lived as I have lived is likely to be made a target at any time, and without being so very fearless, he may get more or less used to the danger, as soldiers, in a way, get used to snipers. I did not like Blackstone, and he was aware of it, so he took that comparatively safe means of getting a little revenge, and was comfortable in the belief that I knew nothing of how he sometimes talked. To my face, he was always friendly. I waited patiently. There was nothing quarrelsome about me. If he wanted to seem to be friendly when an icicle would have been more attentive to him, I could afford to watch him and wait. I came back to San Francisco and would have forgotten him had he not about a year afterward dropped in on me with a casket full of gems. I shall make the incident brief. He wanted me to give him several $1,000s for the lot. I was not interested. His offer dropped and dropped until it came down to a price I really could have afforded to pay. But I do not buy stolen gems, or any other kind. I never bought a piece of ornamental jewelry in my life. He said that he was a stranger and did not know how to go about disposing of the gems and all that sort of thing. But I was a friend and he would give me a good bargain. The casket was slightly larger than an ordinary cigar box, very heavily made, solid, peculiarly so, but a rather plain-looking box, that is, not ornamented in any way beyond a monogram of letters that I made out to be MC. I knew nothing of jewel caskets, but this one seemed to me thick enough to have served for a kind of strong box, except that it had the flimsiest of locks. I suppose that I would have at once sent Blackstone coldly on his way, but it happened that a friend of mine dropped in. He was a little nervous dope fiend who knew a great deal about gems, as every successful pickpocket must. He took a glance at the glittering trinkets and cheerfully called them a fine assortment of glass. Upon being pressed for further information, he declared that the stones were really very good paste. At once it became clear that Blackstone had tried to fleece me. Perhaps it had appealed to his sense of vanity to think he could put something over on me. He knew gems, though if in a hurry he might snatch up a false one by mistake. I was entirely polite, but Mr. Blackstone departed without his casket, or anything to console him for its loss. I thought the incident closed, but a day or so later he telephoned demanding the casket. The conversation was brief. I said goodbye and hung up. He ventured to come to see me and offered a lot of money for the casket. I told him to go to the devil. My room was burglarized, but the burglar neglected to look behind the bathtub. He wrote me a threatening letter, and I began to be interested. Then he telephoned to say that I was a tin horn, a coward, and many other things, and that I had hid the casket for fear somebody would take it away from me. Before hanging up, I assured him that the casket and the gems would be on my table every night from the time I came into the room, and I suggested that he call. I never expected to see him, but somebody was at the door, coming in. 3. Some sense, neither sight nor hearing perhaps, but something such as warns a person when somebody stands noiselessly behind him, told me when the door was opened. The person was using extreme caution. I was wise. True, it might be a random burglar stumbling, so to speak, against my door and hoping to catch off something besides a bullet or two in his legs. But anyone who came knowingly into my room would expect the bullet to reach a more fatal place than legs. A soft, almost noiseless footstep crept onto the carpet, then another and another. I could hear the faint, nervous breathing of the form almost within hand's touch of me. A pause in movement. I waited. I was not excited. I had no reason to be. The cards were all in my favor. True enough, some people do grow agitated when 4 aces fall to them. I am not one of those people. I waited with my fingers motionless against the little brass chain of the light on the stand beside my chair. In those days, and sometimes in these, I would about as soon have my 5 fingers, my hand cut off, and mislaid as to have a gun beyond reach. As it was, I was fully satisfied with the situation. The only trouble about shooting is that it makes a noise and people come to ask questions. A sheaf of spreading light thrust itself out from the electric torch my visitor carried and fell on the empty bed. Simultaneously, I pulled the lamp's cord and, with some effort to be calmly polite, said, "Won't you sit down?" A smothered, futilely strangled little cry of fright, and the woman, a masked woman, with hands that gripped the torch and a small gun pressed in sudden alarm against her bosom, stepped stumblingly back. The eyes shot gleamingly through the mask slits at me. "Push the door to, please," I said pleasantly, trying to speak as naturally as one might under normal conditions to a not unwelcome stranger. I was not going to let her know that I was as much surprised as herself. She stepped slightly to one side and closed the door without taking her eyes off me. "I very nearly grew tired of waiting for you. Please, sit down." I courteously indicated a chair near me. She approached the chair with slow, trance-like movements, her eyes fixed on my face as if hypnotized. She was momentarily bewildered. That was all that was the matter with her. Surprise can deliver a blow scarcely less numbing than a club. She recovered rapidly, however, if not from the surprise, at least from the appearance of it. She sat down with a certain feline care, a suggestion of... I don't know just how to word the impression I got, but I will say that she sat down with a suggestion of daintiness. She tried to convey, and nearly succeeded, that she was not at all uneasy, yet she did not assume any boldness or even nonchalance. I could not see much of her face, for she wore a mask, a domino, a black piece of silk that hid her forehead and eyes. Her mouth seemed just a trifle large. She was a small woman, but as that impression eventually disappeared, I may have had it because at first her mouth gaped a little. She was not at all the type one would suspect of being a female bandit. There was a shade of delicacy about her half-hidden face that the mask did not conceal. I am not inclined to be a romantic over any woman, not even a pretty strange one who comes picturesquely and unbidden into my rooms at such indiscreet hours. I had an idea that she knew she was amazingly pretty. Neither her knowledge of it nor her beauty would serve her so well as she might reasonably expect, for I happen not to be very susceptible to the fair, soft charms of women. That is, I have always been very determined not to be. If women are watched closely, suspected constantly, and not trusted in the least, one can sometimes keep out of their fingers. This little intruder had bobbed wavy hair, light brown hair, that fairly tumbled off her head and clustered about her neck. There was a suggestion of gold about it, merely a flickering glint at times, something like sunlight on deep water. I am not being romantic. I am merely describing her hair accurately. She had on a rather short black pleated dress of what appeared to be some kind of serge, and a blouse of the same material. It was a loose blouse with a scroll of black silk braid running about the breasts. The belt was a wide black piece of unpolished leather caught together by a heavy wide black buckle. She wore shimmering black silk stockings, and her small feet, very small feet, were fitted with a sort of heelless slippers of black soft leather. Her marauding costume seemed to have been designed with an eye toward invisibility. She would have been very inconspicuous in a dim light unless one was attracted by her white bands and the unconcealed part of her face. I looked at her carefully, deliberately, almost critically. I wanted to know as much about her as my eyes could tell me. Then, too, I have found that it disturbs people in an awkward situation to be stared at. She did not seem to care. She was a woman, and so touched her hair appraisingly, adjusted with a fleeting gesture her mask, pushed a fold out of her skirt, and, quick as a flash, turned her little toy-like gun on me, saying sternly, "Hands up!" The situation was not nearly so perilous as I may have made it appear in telling. For one thing, I have found that women seldom shoot a man they have never loved. For another thing, I slowly, very slowly, drew back a corner of the blanket and exposed a gun that could have swallowed the one that she held. My gun nestled in my hand, the muzzle straight at her. If she knew anything of me at all, she knew that I could not miss. She may have known that with anything like a fair shot, I never did miss. A half-minute of motionless tenseness followed. Then she gradually straightened up and sat back in her chair, leaving the little gun in her lap as she slowly half-raised her hands. I leaned over and took the torch and gun from her. I glanced at the gun and tossed it back onto her lap and felt irresistibly a flash of admiration for her. The gun was not loaded. I was not proud of having bluffed out a woman who held a thing worthless as a toy, not even as effective as a toy gun, which will at least make a noise when the cap is fired and perhaps scare somebody. "And what can I do for you?" I asked. Breathlessly, eagerly, she answered. Her voice was wonderfully flexible. It had a trained, pleasing tone that sensitively ran the gamut of inflections. Hers was a truly amazing air of spontaneity, both in manner and voice. Amazingly so, because after the first little bewildered cry, she did not seem frightened. I knew that she was. Anybody would have to be in her situation. She begged me, please, to give her that casket and let her go. The casket belonged to her, she said. I suggested that we grow confidential and that she begin by telling me about herself. I wondered very much that a woman like this should be the confederate of Blackstone. I knew that he fascinated women, but she did not seem to me to be the sort of woman that he would fascinate. He usually caught empty-headed women, rather vapid, characterless creatures. She was not that. "I've made a mistake," she said simply, as if it explained what I wanted to know. "Undoubtedly," I replied, bowing slightly. "I was not asleep." "You should have been. This time of night," she flashed with a good pretense of petulant reproachfulness. She was clever. I began to admire her considerably, though she was desperately trying to play the coquette. She was artful, and it took more daring to seem to be a coquette at that moment than it had taken to pick the lock of my room and enter. She crossed her knees and sat back with an air of sulkiness, her eyes on the casket. "Why," I asked, "all this excitement over Bogus Gems? Glass, paste?" She looked at me quickly with a glimmering of alarm in her eyes, and thereby she confirmed certain suspicions that I had. I guessed that among the collection of paste there was a stone or two of real value, which could easily enough have been overlooked, I thought, by my friend the pickpocket, who had given the casket little more than a casual glance and almost idly had fingered the trinkets. "You have examined it carefully? The box?" she demanded. I assured her, with a rather knowing air, that there wasn't a thing of value in it. She gave a decided start at that, and a hand went out toward the casket as if to seize and inspect it. But I checked her. I told her that the box had been left in my custody. "But it is mine!" she exclaimed. "I must have it! I will have it! Oh, please give it to me!" That was not the sort of appeal to move me. Women, or men, strike the wrong chord if they think to move me by begging. I forgive audacity. I admire bold strokes. I may even be satisfied if some ingenious bit of daring gets the better of me, provided the circumstances are not too serious. But I have no use for beggars, not even when the beggars are pretty women, and I have no gallantry. "Where's Blackstone?" I said abruptly. It took her a few seconds too long to answer, and she replied at first by staring wide-eyed at me and shaking her head slightly. Then, with an air of innocent mystification that was far from deceiving me, asked, "Who is he?" "The man who sent you because he was afraid to come himself," I told her roughly. Though I did not move, did not turn my head, I was sure that I heard a muffled sound at my door. I guessed that Mr. Blackstone might be listening. I hoped so. He would hear something interesting of himself before I had finished. "Oh?" she said. "Mr. Blackstone?" "Yes, the gentleman who permits the women he has kissed to pay his expenses." "Oh!" Involuntarily her eyes went toward the door. I did not seem to notice. A pause followed. She seemed to be studying me closely, hesitantly trying to decide something. At last, low-voiced, she said, "I have heard of you. I wonder—" Her eyes went furtively toward the door and came back to my face as she went on. "I wonder if you are a gentleman." I told her bluntly that I was not, that I was a gambler, a professional gambler. When a woman begins to appeal to a man to be a gentleman, it is high time to throw up breastworks. "Blackstone's a gentleman," I added. "He is hidden behind your skirts. I would rather be a crook." Something very near to a smile came to her lips, but went away. She seemed really agitated without showing much nervousness, or more accurately, I had the impression that she was highly keyed, as if about to venture something desperate. Rather than that there should be protracted silence, I went into some detail regarding Blackstone. I told some of the things that I knew, that he was a venomous cad and cheat, liar and rascal, without a thing in the world of personal courage to make even Satan's imps respect him. "You say that behind his back," she remarked, but I could not tell precisely what she meant. It was not exactly as if suggesting a reproach, nor quite like doubt if what I said was true, but she rather conveyed the idea of wonder as to what I would say to his face or do if confronted by him. "True," I answered. "His back is all that he presents these days, and that only at a distance, a safe distance. She said that it was not like what she had heard of me, that I should boast. But I am suspicious of women when they pay compliments, though she did it exceedingly well. I told her that I did not understand. She hesitated, and again her eyes went a little anxiously toward the door, and I thought that I understood what was the matter. She seemed to be wanting to say something to me, yet was also aware that a listener was at the door. However, it might be that she was outguessing me, playing a deeper game than she thought I would imagine. It is hard to tell about women. Their simplicity and their subtlety is often so bewilderingly alike. That is what makes them so hard to understand. "Please listen," she said. "That casket was stolen from me. I must have it. I will pay anything. It is money you want, isn't it?" "Usually, yes, money. But why this sudden interest in the casket?" "It hasn't been sudden with me, Mr. Everhard. I was frantic when my sister missed the casket, but I didn't know who had taken it." "I see. You didn't suspect Blackstone." "I didn't know who had taken it," she repeated, seemingly a little anxious not to offend Mr. Blackstone's eavesdropping ears. "Then I learned that you had it. You have refused every offer. I simply must have it. My sister's future is at stake." "You think a great deal of your sister, don't you? Why didn't you come to me at once?" She almost whispered. "I didn't dare." "Dare? Dare?" I repeated, and significantly gestured my surprise that anyone dared not meet me in daylight, yet come at such an hour in such a manner. "Oh, I can explain," she said quickly, feverishly. I watched her closely. If that was acting, it was good acting. But one is always at a disadvantage with women unless they are distrusted, and even then, one doesn't have much security. "Would you prefer to explain to me, or to the police?" I asked coolly. If she had known as much about me as she thought she did, she would have known that I never called on the police. They sometimes called on me, but I shall say this for them, they were always polite. She did not know of my aversion to signaling a policeman. She did not know that I never go to them. She shuddered and sat upright with a jerk. "Oh, please, no. Can't you be generous? Please, I must have that casket. I must have it. I can't pay an enormous sum, but I'll pay everything I have." I scowled and slowly shook my head. It irritates me to be begged. "Why," I asked coldly, "are you afraid of Blackstone? He is a poisonous, cowardly little snake." "I know it," she whispered almost inaudibly. "He is my husband." I nodded slowly as if I believed her. I did not wholly believe her. No, I simply didn't trust her. She had brains, that woman, and I could not imagine such a woman as she being taken in by a fellow like that. My hearing is sensitive, exceptionally acute, and I thought that I heard a sound not unlike a restless, impatient slip of hand or foot outside of my door. My ears listened. My eyes watched her. "Everything is there?" she asked, indicating the casket. "Yes, everything is on that table," I replied, glancing toward it. On the table were papers, a bulbous vase from which half a dozen fragrant carnations raised their ragged blossoms, a book or two, and the casket, bulking black and solidly against the vase. I then said she should tell me why she was so anxious to have that casket and its bogus gems. I said it in such a way as to imply the threat that she would perhaps regret her silence if she refused, but I did not hold out any kind of promise. "He made me come," she whispered excitedly. "He said you wouldn't shoot a woman, honestly." I knew Blackstone would not hesitate to do a thing of the kind, but I could not imagine him making a woman such as she do anything she did not care to do, particularly turn robber to steal paste. It was a peculiar situation indeed. The husband, or alleged husband, listening at the door wherein his wife entered as a burglar. I, fully aware that he was at the door, yet pressing his wife on threat of arrest to tell me things which might infuriate him. It was not only a peculiar situation, but also one that did not displease me. She was afraid of him, or seemed to be, and she did not quite trust me. The distrust was mutual. I simply listened to what she said. I did not believe her, and yet scarcely disbelieved her. She seemed trying to make up her mind to be frank, or to appear frank. It usually amounts to the same thing in a woman. There is one great disadvantage in distrusting women. When they are truthful, one is sure not to believe them, and a woman is never so dangerous as when she is truthful. She made several beginnings, said a word, paused, started again, hesitated, then removed her mask and fingered the elastic with which it had been fastened about her head. My ears were very intent on the door, and Without appearing to move so as to be in a better position to glance at it, I edged around a little. I had the strong feeling that something was about to happen. At last she threw down the mask as if indicative of her decision to throw her story to me. But whether or not she had decided to tell a true story, or had simply decided on what lie would suit, was rather difficult to decide. If it were a false story, I could not compliment her imagination. It was commonplace enough to be true. She spoke in a low voice and leaned forward confidentially as if not to be overheard. But I said to myself, that may be only an artifice. Women like to appear confidential. It is one of their favorite attributes. She said that she had met Blackstone when she was young and foolish. She had married him. He left her. She heard that he was dead. She believed it. She went on to the stage. She took another name. She thought Blackstone was clear out of her life. A few months before, she had met a young man, a wealthy young man who loved her, whom she loved. He had gone to China on business. He was returning, and she had come to San Francisco to meet him. His ship was due tomorrow. She had been in San Francisco about 3 weeks. She had taken an apartment and was living very quietly, waiting for the man she loved. Then one night, Blackstone walked into her rooms, her husband. He had seen her on the street, recognized her, followed her. He had gone through everything she had, taken some jewelry, sneered at the casket and its contents, made her give him money. Then one day she missed the casket itself. He denied knowing anything about it, and at last she told him it was worth money and that she had to have it. Then she told her he had sold it to me, that I was a fellow he didn't like and he had enjoyed selling me paste. She had told him that they were not all paste and that it was worth $30,000, that she must have it. She wanted it, she said to me, to return to the man she loved, who had given her the casket and its contents as an engagement present. But, of course, Blackstone was only agitated by the eager desire to get his hands on so much wealth. "I can never explain to him, but I must return his gifts," she cried. Of course, she told me all that much more expressively, even more rapidly than I have related it. She spoke fast, with disconnected phrases that were as enlightening as sentences would have been, and as she talked, she leaned nearer and nearer to me, and her voice rose until at last, as if careless of who heard her, she cried out that she would return those jewels. She must return them. I did not believe her. $30,000 was too much money. Neither Blackstone nor my pickpocket could have overlooked gems of that extreme value. But I did not have much time to think. She was leaning very close to me, and one of her hands was laid on my arm, and the fingers pressed tightly as if to hold my attention by physical force. The fingers of her other hand ran up along my arm with a kind of beseeching tenderness. "Please, please, please," she begged. But I flung her backward and shot, and the man died just as he stood tiptoe facing me through 8 inches of open door. A revolver was in his hand, and it exploded from the spasmodic twitch of his fingers as he went down on his face sprawlingly, shot through his forehead. His bullet hit the floor by my chair. It was all over in 3 ticks of a clock, for he had made the fatal mistake of hissing, "You and my wife," and I killed him. "You lose," I said frigidly to her, adding that as a trap she and her man had made a pretty flimsy thing of it. "So help me God, I've told you the truth," she said tensely, breathless, staring down at the body. She stood with hand to throat, half shrinking as from a thing of horror, yet fascinated. I told her that she had better not say a word more until she had heard me lie, that then she could tell her story any way she pleased. I did not know what kind of a mess I might be in for, with police investigation and a strange woman for witness, but I thought that I had her at a disadvantage. Anyway, I would give her a fighting chance to get out. As for Blackstone, I snatched up the mask she had dropped, rammed a pencil through it to serve for a bullet hole, and quickly placed it on his forehead. Then, tossing the little toy gun out of sight, I went to the door, where soon were gathered people in bathrobes, and without them, men and women, some of whom chattered in nervous excitement, though they tried to hold their teeth set. I treated the curious mob in a fashion friendly enough. I seemed to do my best to answer a dozen questions at once, but I told nobody anything. I seemed trying to explain in the midst of interruptions, and though I kept everybody out of the room, I let them jostle me at the door and peer through morbidly, some of them perhaps sympathetically, at the pretty young woman in my room who huddled forward, was weeping with hands to face. But, of course, no one could come into the room or touch the body of the dead man until the police arrived. Everyone was tense with nervous curiosity. Though the man lay on his face, all could see that he was masked. It seemed mysterious and thrilling. The police came, the police patrol. It came rattling down the street through one of San Francisco's heavy fogs, and the policeman hustled with an air of directness and business through the crowd about my door. They knew me at a glance, and though their eyes were a little suspicious, they were respectful. My record was not above suspicion, but it was unindictable. I told my story. I had not been able to sleep. I had sat up trying to read. I had heard a noise in the hall, then a sort of scuffling, not loud, but strange enough to arouse curiosity. I had gone to the door and listened, barely opening it. Almost at once a woman had flung herself against it. She could hardly talk. She was out of breath and frightened. She staggered into the room, gasping for me to save her. I had been surprised and did not know quite what to do, and had just turned around when a shot was fired, and having a gun on the arm of my chair, I had snatched it up and shot. I mentioned to the policeman, just to remind them, that at times I could shoot rapidly. I had whirled and shot. I did not know the woman. I had never seen her before. The man was masked. That was my story. Not truthful, perhaps, but honest. The woman could get from the net as well as she could. I had no great sympathy for her, for I was more than half inclined to believe that she had leaned so close to me, had gripped my arm so hard and let her fingers run up my arm so pleadingly, to distract my attention from the door and give Blackstone a chance to come in and cover me with his gun, and perhaps shoot. She may have been sincere, and he may have merely jumped at the chance of seeking an excuse to kill me by pretending to find his wife and me together. Neither the truth as she might tell it, nor what lies she could imagine would very well discredit my story. I told it first. I told it plausibly. Besides, the dead man wore a mask, and the police are never inclined to side with masked men, living or dead. She might say I had poked a pencil through the black silk, but then she would have to explain how the mask came to be in the room, and so implicate herself, whereas I had given her a loophole if she had the ingenuity to take it. When the police came into the room, other people tried to follow. They tried to crowd close to hear what the woman would say, but everyone was pushed back into the hall, and a big policeman put his arm like a bar across the door. When I had finished with my story, the woman flashed a look at me that I did not understand, just a flash from the corner of her eye when I approached and cut off other people's view from her face. The look appeared more full of astonishment than anything else, but there also seemed to be a little something of gratitude. She sobbed convincingly and in a broken voice and with nodding head said that I'd told just what had happened. The police had looked into the dead man's face, but none of them recognized him. She told his name. She said that he had hounded her, that she could not escape him, and that she was afraid of him. He had threatened to kill her because she would not be his wife. She sobbed a great deal at that point, in order, I think, to get time to decide how best to go on. One big policeman laid a hand gently on her shoulder and spoke encouragingly. She went on. She lived at the apartment next door. He must have learned in some way that she was planning to move so as to hide from him. Shortly before midnight, he had telephoned that he would kill her if she tried to run away from him. Later, he telephoned again that he was coming out and that he was going to wear a mask so that he could kill her without anyone recognizing him. He must have been drunk, she said. He was often drunk. She snatched a handful of things together and fled, but he had met her right at the entrance. She broke away from him and ran. He followed. She darted through the entrance next door and ran up the stairs. He had caught her by the skirt and put the gun to her head, but she had tripped him and fled down the hall and burst into my room. After that, everything happened as I said. As a preliminary story, the police were ready to accept it. Things more strange than she told happened daily under their noses, and nothing remained except to confirm her story by going to the apartment next door. I wondered if she had thought of that when she gave an address so near at hand. She had said that her name was Marjorie Klein, and before she left the room I had no reason to question her ingenuity and resourcefulness. She stood up to go with the officers. Without a flaw, she kept the role I had thrust upon her. She looked pathetic and appealing. She was pretty, and she did appear helpless, thoroughly distressed, so much so that the policemen, who were rather cynical and not easily made sympathetic toward people who tell strange stories, were gentle, even kind with her. She spoke to me weakly, without offering a hand-clasp or thanks, which would not have looked well, and said that she was sorry she had brought such trouble upon me. I bowed remotely and did not return any polite phrases. Then she did a daring thing. She picked up the black casket from the table, picked it up swiftly, and handed it with a sort of explanatory gesture toward the biggest policeman, saying that it contained a few little trinkets with which she had fled her room. The policeman looked at me, but before I could say anything, I don't know that I would have said much anyway, she explained further. "Oh, yes, it's mine. See the monogram, MC?" He took it in his hand, scrutinized it, and handed it back to her. Together they went out, leaving me staring through the doorway. The policeman who kept watch over the dead sat down, lighted a cigar, flicked ashes on the carpet, and began to talk of other dead men and the various ways in which they had found their deaths. I bent over and put my nose to the carnations. I had of late been showing a rather unusual interest in flowers. Suddenly, a heavy uniformed man burst into the room. "She's got away!" he cried. "The little devil slipped right around the corner. Wasn't watching her. Never suspected a thing. They never heard of her at the apartment next door, and she's gone, right into the fog." The big fellow smashed his fist into an open palm and swore feelingly. Then questions came rapidly at me, but I stood pat. I knew nothing more of her than I had told. Nothing was to be got out of me, not at that late hour. Then the ambulance came, and the policeman and the dead man went away. When they were gone, I made sure the blinds were down, hung a cap on the doorknob, and emptied the large bulbous vase into the water bowl. Then I fished out rings, bracelets, earrings, and such, and dried them on a bath towel and tumbled the collection on the bed. I went over them carefully, but as I knew nothing of gems anyway, it was not surprising that I found none I could pronounce genuine. The next day I received a note. It was a short note, but it came from the woman whose name I never knew, for she said that it was not Marjorie Klein, but something like that. She assured me that her story, as she had told it to me, was true, literally true, and that I was welcome to the paste gems as mementos from her, because the casket had a false bottom where the real jewels were hidden. The lock was flimsy, so a robber might break it open easily, and then finding the paste duplicates, fill his pockets and go with nothing of value. The note ended. "Oh, I hope it isn't a terrible thing to say, but I believe my prayers to be freed from that beastly man were heard in heaven. For my ship came in today, and I can be happy now. MC." End of section 2. Section 3 of The Early Adventures of Don Everhard by Gordon Young. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Blackmail. As usual, when a woman gets into trouble, Mrs. Vera Venables expected some man to help her out. I did not know Mrs. Venables. I did not want to know her. I did not even care to know that she was young and pretty. Dick Venables was a friend of mine, but he had always shown poor judgment in women. Men usually do when they believe a woman is as desirable as she looks. I had never met his wife. I do not care to meet wives. But Mrs. Venables called upon me with pearls in her ears and tears in her eyes. She was furred and frocked and, I said to myself, had done her best to look dainty and helpless. "I love Richard more than anything else in the world," she said after stammering through a rather surprising story. "But why come to me?" I asked again. I had wedged that question in 2 or 3 times previously, but she had ignored it. "You are his best friend, and I was sure you would help his wife." She leaned forward sweetly and smiled expectantly. But as I was not gallant enough to spring up and promise all she asked, the expectancy rather withered and she dropped back, again tearful. I was not aware that I was Venables' best friend. If he thought so, it was because of his own folly. His folly had gotten him into trouble, and, well, I gave him some advice, loaned him some money, for his father had been a watchful man, and sent my card in to the swindler that had bilked him. When that swindler had read Don Everhard, he fairly bounced in his eagerness to give Venables back the money got through a phony faro layout. That swindler and I had met before. 1 or 2 other little things turned up, and Venables was as grateful as a lost dog that had been patted on the head. He sang my praises, but I did not care much for the tune. I am susceptible to flattery, of course, but I scarcely think it flattery to have a young enthusiast proclaim right and left that I am a sort of Robin Hood, willing to do any kind of crooked work as long as it helps a deserving friend. Nothing of the kind. I am perfectly willing to pluck the tail feathers of vultures, to trim a swindler or trip a crook by tricks of his own trade, but I never stole 10 cents from anybody that dared carry his tail to the police. I've had to live by my wits, and that is not the easiest way in the world for a man honest as myself, that is, reasonably honest, to make a living. Venables was a young fool, but I liked him. He had married a pretty woman, and she protested, or affirmed, or whatever it is that women do in convincing strangers that they love their husbands, that she loved him. Venables was a fellow of touchy honor and high temper. Also, he was rich. His father's recent death had left him with money. My personal opinion was that Miss Vera, whatever her maiden name, had looked into the condition of old Venables' health before permitting herself to love Dick. Anyway, she had come to me with a most lamentable tale and asked me to loan her $10,000. I was Dick's dearest friend, and she was his wife. If she had asked for 10 cents car fare, I wouldn't have thought much about it, but I needed money almost as much as she. One reason I have appeared respectable in spite of all the things people say of me has been due to the so-called quiet elegance of my manner of living. A professional gambler, but I wear no jewelry. My apartment is always in the most respectable and expensive neighborhood. My clothes are always of dark cloth and made by the tailors that charge the most. I am reputed to be wealthy, so I have many friends. Mrs. Venables seemed to think that I could loan her $10,000 about as easily as I really could have loaned her car fare. Anyway, she had come confident that I would. It is impossible to tell anything about women. That is one reason why I try to leave them alone. They are incomprehensible. Consider Mrs. Venables. She was up against a blackmailer. What was the nature of the documentary evidence offered her in exchange for $10,000, I do not know. She offered to tell me all, but I did not care to listen, first because I would have no way of knowing that she was telling me the truth, and secondly because I did not care to share any intimate secrets with a woman so consciously pretty and so tyrannously helpless as Mrs. Venables. But she came to me, a stranger, a friend of her husband's, asking for money to buy from a blackmailer a secret that she would rather die than have Dick know. That is feminine logic. And the maddening thing is that such crazy logic is usually accurate. But as Dick's best friend, I said slowly, it is my duty to tell him. Oh, no, she said softly, widening her eyes to a wistful look, smiling with a faint trace of sorrow and half putting out her hands to me in an effective little gesture of protest. I like to watch these little artifices of women. They do them so well. Oh, no, you are a gentleman. It seems, as nearly as I can tell from observation, that a man who is also a gentleman is one that always does precisely what some woman wants. Mrs. Venables had told me that a lawyer, a certain Edward Spence, had come into possession of a certain photograph. Certain kind of photograph, I think she meant, together with, of course, the inevitable indiscreet letters. She said the photograph had been faked and retouched. That is, that a clever artist had taken a real photograph and with deft touches made it appear fearfully indelicate, and then had other photographs made from it which were seemingly the genuine originals. Such work can be done. It is done every day. But the letters were genuine. They weren't terrible letters, no, but as a supplement to the photograph they were indefensibly compromising. I did not want details. I do not care to have any woman degrade herself by a painful confession to me. And on the other hand, I don't like to have to go to the trouble of wondering whether or not she has lied. Mr. Edward Spence wanted $10,000. He made the usual threats. If Dick's half the man I think he is, I said, he will break Mr. Spence's head and gladly pay the fine for disturbing the peace. She promptly threw out the danger signals of hysteria. Her hands fluttered nervously, her lower lip quivered, and her eyes began darting wildly about the room. I did not want a hysterical woman in my apartment, my eminent, respectable apartment, particularly not when she was the wife of one who claimed me as his best friend. Dick must never know. I'll kill myself. I couldn't stand it. If you won't help me, I don't know what I shall do, etc. I gestured protestingly and begged her to calm herself. She wouldn't calm herself. She wanted to cry, and she did. And what is more, I promised to help her. I just had to get rid of her. There was no other way. She instantly brightened and beamed and sighed and held out her hand to me. Then she left trippingly. One could tell that she was a happy and contented woman. She had transferred her worries to a man's shoulder. 2. I don't know what she would have thought if she had known what I intended. I intended to be well paid for my part in the blackmail. I needed money, and the more I thought of it, the more it seemed that Mrs. Venables' visit had been a special fortune. Some inquiries made in various places brought a wealth of information about Mr. Spence. I had a pretty wide acquaintance among what is called the underworld, and if I were compiling a list of friends who were friends, I am afraid I would have to go to the police records to find out pretty much the early history and achievements of my most loyal and dependable acquaintances. Mr. Spence was ostensibly a lawyer. He was clever, also prosperous. Perhaps he was too clever to be cornered. He seemed to conduct a regular blackmail business, and he did it adroitly. I gathered that he always pretended to be protecting his victims from blackmailers. His method of working was this. He had told Mrs. Venables that an unnamed party had brought to him the letters and photograph and asked him to settle with her for what he could get. Mr. Spence declared that he had protested indignantly against being insulted by having such a proposal made to him. The party then said very well he would take his photograph and letters to some lawyer that knew when he had a good thing. The party had wanted $50,000. Now Mr. Spence thought he saw a chance to do Mrs. Venables a favor. If she wanted this party arrested, he, Mr. Spence, would promptly have him arrested. This was a clever part of Spence's procedure, as it gave him an insight into how likely the victim would be to fight. If she didn't care to have him arrested and really wished to make a settlement and get the unfortunate documents out of the way, he, Spencer, would do his best to arrange for as small a settlement as possible. Of course, he was not to get a penny of the money. He was merely aiding Mrs. Venables to make the best of a bad situation, and his fee for services would be quite moderate. That's the sort of story she had told me. But naturally I knew that Spence was a liar, for no honest man or lawyer dabbles with blackmailers. I found out that Spence's reputation for doing precisely that sort of thing several times a month was pretty well established by those in a position to know. Perhaps the police were not, but certain of my friends knew other people who made a business of selling blackmail material to Spence. I called on him. He had a beautiful office, one of those large, expensive offices, a trifle dim and quiet, with oriental rugs on the floor and severely plain but expensive furniture. It was the most respectable and impressive-looking office imaginable. On the door, in simple style, was his name, Edward Spence. Inside was a neat young woman. Had I an appointment with Mr. Spence? I had not. It would be necessary. I protested that my business was urgent. She was sorry. It seemed to me that her eyes narrowed a little, as if she was not unaccustomed to having people with the claim of urgent business, and knew how to handle them with tact and firmness. Across the room there was a door marked Private. I had stated my wish to see Mr. Spence, and she had made her reply. I had nothing more to say. I did not intend to leave without seeing Mr. Spence, and I did not care to argue the matter with an office assistant, particularly with a woman office assistant. For one thing, all the women I have ever tried to argue with can say 3 words to my 1. I simply stepped to one side, walked past her, heard her gasp, shook her hands off as she clutched at my arm, opened the door marked Private, stepped inside, and slammed it in her face. A neat little fat man who had his feet cocked on the table and a novel in his hands seemed on the point of jumping out of the window. I had closed the door with some firmness. It made considerable noise in that quiet office. "What do you want? What do you want? What do you want?" he repeated rapidly as he eyed me, and all the while his hand was groping in a half-opened drawer. All that had taken scarcely 5 seconds. Then came a relieved, "Ah!" and Mr. Spencer's manner was transformed into one of cool suavity. Evidently he had got his hand on the gun and felt better. "Mr. Spence, I believe?" "Who are you?" he demanded. "Just a minute, please," I said quietly, lifting a chair nearer to his desk and sitting down as I laid my hat and stick on his table. Then I added, "I have a little business matter to talk over with you. The young lady out there was under the impression that you were busy. Now, take that gun out of the drawer and aim it at my head if that will compose you any. You are really too nervous to talk business." He shut the drawer with a vicious blow and turned intensely red. Mr. Spencer was quite bald, and I could see the blood mounting even to his scalp. Your impudence! Your impudence!" But he evidently could think of nothing more. He was standing and moved his feet restively. Yes, I said slowly, nodding in amiable agreement. "It is mine." Then, with business-like directness, "Now, regarding Mrs. Venables." His hand shot out and clutched at the handle of the drawer. I had no scruples against tormenting that fat little sleek vampire, so with every appearance of seriousness I said, "Supposing you lay it on the desk where it is handy, and I'll put mine there too." With that I drew one of my automatics, and I carry only those of a formidable size, on the desk and let my fingers rest on the handle. "Oh, for blank's sake, put that up." "Put that up!" he cried. "What are you going to do? Murder me? Murder me?" His terror was real. I tried to assume a mild, surprised expression as I assured him that nothing could have been further from my thoughts, that I had only thought it would be well to let him see how it felt to have someone continually clawing and reaching for a gun as he had been doing. He was shaken, but regained his composure, mopped his face, and smiled laboriously as he sat down. I have been told that I have no sense of humor. It is true that I seldom, if ever, laugh and rarely smile. However, I wanted to laugh at the way he eyed that automatic as I lifted it up to return it to my pocket, but lingeringly fondled it for a moment or two. "Now, regarding Mrs. Venables, I am a friend of hers." Instantly he began his protest that he had only been doing her a favor, and all that sort of thing. "Oh,
I said with a mild air of disappointment that jerked him up into a comical attitude of incredulity and expectancy.
"Eh?"
he said, and went on suavely. "Was there some particular angle of the matter you wanted to talk over with me?" "Why, yes, I believe the blackmailer from whom you are trying to save Mrs. Venables, you know? Yes, I believe he first expected, in fact demanded, $50,000. And you, having contempt for that miserable, vulturous work and desiring to benefit Mrs. Venables, succeeded in lowering the demand to the modest sum of $10,000. He unctuously rubbed his puffy hands and assumed a modestly virtuous expression. "Yes, he admitted. "But I happen to know that Mrs. Venables is in a position to, and is willing to, pay $50,000. His jaw nearly fell from his face. His puffy blue eyes bulged. Had I put my foot in his stomach, I could not have given a greater blow to his nervous system. At last he collected himself enough to remark, "But I thought—" "That is just it," I interrupted calmly. "I am a friend of hers. That is how I know, she told me. I've not been a gambler, a professional gambler, since I was a youngster, a mere youth in my teens, without learning the art of the expressionless face. I simply looked at him as I would have done had I drawn cards, then bet against his pat hand. A gradual illumination crept over his features, and he rubbed his hands softly and leaned toward me confidentially as he murmured, I see, ah. But he was not yet willing to compromise himself with me. I needed money, and I was prepared for such little difficulties as I had anticipated. My name is Don Everhard. I am a professional gambler, or used to be before the police interfered with that profession. Now I pick up an honest dollar wherever I can find it."
"Seems to me I've heard that name,"
he said doubtfully, struggling with his memory. "Yes, I have sometimes had the misfortune to be mentioned in the papers. You see, on one or two occasions people have shot at me by mistake. That is, under the impression, you understand, that they could shoot quicker than I.
I do remember
now." And he mentioned a little affair that had attracted a modicum of attention, but he did not seem as enthusiastic as I had hoped. "I suggest, Mr. Spence, that you look me up. Make a few inquiries. You will find that I have not and never did have the remotest connection with the police, and that I have lived by my wits. You expect $10,000. Mrs. Venables will gladly pay $50,000. That's $25,000 apiece." He started to protest again that he had no interest, no financial interest beyond his modest fee in the matter. "But she will gladly pay it," I insisted. He mentioned that she had seemed depressed and hopeless over paying $10,000. I smiled condescendingly and assured him that the ways of women were incomprehensible, that she had mentioned to me that she had put on the air of distress for his benefit. "Venables is a millionaire, and generous. It is easy for her to buy a necklace, pay $50,000, and produce paste that cost only $1,000. Then what happens? Why, she becomes afraid of losing such precious stones and locks them up in the safety deposit vault, to remain indefinitely. Really, Mr. Spence, I am afraid that that the party who is making his demands through you did not fully appreciate his opportunity."
"But why do you come?"
he asked coolly. He was now the smooth, hard blackmailer, cunning and dangerous. My abrupt entrance and the trifling gunplay had for a time brought his essential cowardice to the surface. "Because I am proposing a way to get $50,000 instead of $10,000. I, as the very close friend of Mrs. Venables, will assure her that she must pay the larger demand." Mr. Spence grunted. Then coolly and impudently, I came near admiring him for his audacity, he explained that he was obliged to me for the tip, but I could not expect $25,000. $5,000, he said, was the most.
"You have brains, Everhard, but you slipped. Now that you've put me wise, I don't need your help to go on. 50,000 is what she has come through with, and you take what I give you or nothing. How's that?"
He was almost jocular. Evidently he did have courage of a sort when dealing with fellow blackmailers, and I could imagine how he beat down the dirty vermin that came in with secrets of the rich to sell. But it seemed that Mr. Spence was not thoroughly acquainted with my reputation. $25,000 is a lot of money, and I do not believe there are many people who will, even behind my back, accuse me of being timid. "I am sorry, Mr. Spence," I said with a carefully aggrieved air. I hoped that we would be able to come to an amicable and profitable agreement. I showed you how to make this deal 5 times bigger than you planned, and
I'd been thinking it over, he lied, and was just about decided to boost the price. I'll give you $5,000. That's like finding it for you.
I paused, then smiled just a little. It was perhaps a little like the smile of a man who has 4 aces and the joker up his sleeve, for I was not bluffing. "Spence," I said abruptly, picking my stick and hat from the table and standing up. I put some feeling into my words, too. "Spence, I see you are a dirty, low-down crook. You can keep me from getting $25,000 or even a penny from this deal, but you will pay $25,000 cash in advance or you won't get a nickel out of it yourself." I said it impressively. I meant it. He was astounded, also frightened. "No," I assured him contemptuously. "I'm not going to shoot, or beat you up, or anything like that. No. Somebody else may, though."
"What do you mean?"
he asked slowly. "I came in here with a fair 50-50 proposition. You steal the idea and throw me a sop. From now on, I talk to you in terms of cash, in advance, in advance."
"You're crazy,"
he said almost involuntarily. "Am I? Now pay close attention." I looked at my watch. "I am coming in here tomorrow afternoon at this time, 3:20, and you have $25,000 in cash ready for me, or when I leave this office, I shall go straight to Richard Venables and tell him the whole story. Where will your blackmail scheme be? Your only chance to get a nickel is to keep it from him. What is more, Venables has a temper and loves his wife. He may possibly throw his wife over, but he'll get you on the street or in some cafe. That's the sort of fellow he is. Now what do you say?"
"You wouldn't do it,"
he said dubiously. I didn't answer that remark at all. I had said I would, and that settled it as far as I was concerned. I meant it. I would have done it. Then from Spence,
"But if I give you the money, how do I know I'll get $50,000 out of her?"
He was weakening. "You don't," I admitted bluntly. "But I have never yet broken a promise, not even to a dirty little blackmailer. And the day after tomorrow, you pay me first. In this room, Mrs. Venables will hand you $50,000.
"All right,"
he said quickly.
"Then I'll split it with you, just as soon as she pays it over."
"No. Mine has to be in cash, in advance. I wouldn't trust you."
"Well, I won't trust you either."
"Very well," I said, turning toward the door.
Hey, wait a minute. Wait, we've got to settle this."
"It is a very simple matter with me. If you don't agree to my proposition, I shall tell Venables tonight. If you don't live up to it tomorrow, I shall tell him then. If you do, Mrs. Venables will come in here day after tomorrow and hand you the money." I paused. He did not answer. I turned to the door and started out. I was not bluffing in the least.
"Hey, wait a minute. Wait, I'll do it."
It cost him an effort, a big effort. He was trembling and red again. "Thank you," I said. 3:20 tomorrow, and cash. Goodbye." And I walked out. 3. I believe that I am a fortunate man. Again and again, over and over, it has been proved to me that my friends in the underworld are real friends. I have known many of them for years, since I was a taciturn and somewhat quick-triggered youth out in San Francisco. I have taken pains, in as quiet a way as possible, to impress upon them that I value their friendship. With many of them, the friendship was intimate, and they had generously made a good name for me in circles where, according to more conventional opinions, it is disgraceful to have a good name. If a fellow wanted to go straight, I helped him. If he got slammed in stir for failing to go straight, and I knew of it, I helped him. I did not preach. I did not encourage them one way or the other. I have been censured for my intimacy with them, but I know them. I know their loyalty and generosity and humor, as well as their evil qualities. And they are evil at times. Who is not? I could not picture them as reformed crooks or as fellows clutched by circumstances. That would be quite wrong. They were active safecrackers and pickpockets, conmen and all manner of things, except sneak thieves and burglars. Even I draw the line at the coward that, armed and ready to kill, sneaks into a home at night where there are women and children. There is potential decency in the safecracker that takes his chance with watchmen and policemen, in the pickpocket that matches wits against men on the street and detectives. and confidence gamesters that bunco wiseacres. Not that I sanction or condone that work, I do not. But there is something redeemable, something of inner character about men that do not sneak. All of which may be a rather tedious preliminary to the statement that after leaving Spence's office, I thought I would rather like to call on a few of my old-time acquaintances, whom I knew to be getting a livelihood behind the backs of policemen. It wasn't often that I went to them, or they came to me for that matter. In the back room of a saloon, I met Eel McGuire and one or two of his gang. They did not look like typical crooks, not at all, and McGuire was one of the slipperiest fellows that ever spent money from another man's pocket. He was a daring dip and was said to have eyes in his fingers. I talked to him about Spence. McGuire knew of him, in fact, described him in some detail. I did not tell of my experience with Spence. It would have involved too much explanation. But it was a pleasant little meeting, and McGuire, red-headed and humorous, declared he hadn't had so much fun since he pinched the watch off of one of the Secret Service men detailed to guard the president. He seemed to get an inordinate amount of amusement out of imagining the expression that appeared on the faces of his victims when they discovered their losses, and he gave several pantomimes for my benefit. 4. I telephoned and made a dinner appointment for downtown with Richard Venables. He accepted with an eagerness that made me almost regretful that I had, with perhaps a suggestion of rudeness, persistently declined his invitations, some of which were avowedly for the purpose of introducing me to his wife. I am not sentimental. I refuse to be. If I think something I am about to do is sentimental, I willfully do something else. But I went to an artist friend of mine, a poor fellow in perpetual debt but clever, and he took me to a photographer, and I had a picture taken of myself leaning leisurely against an Ionic column. After some conversation with the artist and photographer, during which they laughed considerably, largely because I seemed so serious, arrangements were finally concluded for a photographic series that I wished to show to a friend. So far as I could remember, it was the first time I had ever posed for a picture since the wavy-haired days of childhood, when my mother plucked me bodily from my toys and carried me off to a lank man with greasy hair and had my picture taken. But then I explained emphatically to myself that there was no sentiment connected with this photograph which I had arranged for. Richard Venables was in appearance pretty much of a typical young American, somewhat heavier perhaps than the type, but not hung at all with loose flesh. He had athletic tendencies and a curious and almost disconcerting frankness. I had liked him in spite of myself, for as a matter of principle I refused to like the idle sons of wealthy fathers. When my wits were fagged or fortune impudent, I have lived, so to speak, on crusts and water. Naturally, I have an antipathy for youths born to the purple and swathed in eiderdown. But when Venables had been in trouble, I had had something of a personal grievance of long standing against the swindler that nailed him. And afterwards Venables was so frankly grateful, so persistently friendly, so unaffectedly conscious of being a dunce, that I respected him. And of course, whenever he got into trouble again, he came to tell me of it, with that kind of trusting hopefulness that more or less obligates the confidant to do something. And I did. Halfway through the dinner, he mentioned his wife for the 7th or 8th time. I could no longer evade her without being deliberately rude, and there was something about Venables that made one not want to hurt him. That is, to hurt his feelings. "Oh, yes, tell me of her," I said with a hypocritical semblance of earnestness. He did. Frankly, enthusiastically, illusionedly, he was in love with her. Vera was the most wonderful woman in the world. Before and since, from youths and others all the way to the grayed side of middle age, from all manner of men in all stages of sobriety and lack of it, I have heard this most wonderful woman in the world. Her name varies. She is now Mary, then Martha, presently Margaret, or maybe Ruth, Rachel, or Retta, Rose, or Renee, and she is always the same, whatever her complexion, weight, or height. "How much do you love her?" I asked bluntly. One of the penalties in being the best friend of any man is that he treats you as a father-confessor for love affairs, whether the affair be with his own wife or someone else's. "How much?" he replied in a stupefied fashion, precisely as if I had asked him to estimate numerically the grains of sand on a beach. "Yes, and why?" "Why?" he repeated, frankly dazed. "You love her enough to feed her and clothe her as long as she pets you and kisses you and doesn't stare across the room. You love her because she is dear and sweet and won't make you ashamed of having loved her. Dick, not one woman in 20,000 knows what love is. Not one man in 1,000,000. That is not a reckless ratio either. Real love is lunacy. It doesn't give a trooper's blank for a woman's past or future, whether she is approved of by friends or an intimate of people one could not tolerate as acquaintances. This thing called love, that is solemnized in most marriages as merely an agreement to live together so long as neither party shocks, disgraces, or embarrasses the other. I am not disparaging marriage or crying up love. The conventional arrangement is the most comfortable, but... He cut in abruptly. Listen, I see what you're driving at, and you are wrong. You've talked to me before about women, and it had a big influence when I met Vera. I've told her all about you and what you said, too. She's never met you, but she's wanted to awfully. You don't know how much we talk of you. Vera didn't want to marry me. I knew why. She doesn't know that I knew. But you once said that a man had no more business meddling with a woman's secrets than he had cutting into her breast to watch her heartbeat. It set me thinking. You're saying a woman is what she is because of what she has been. And if you love her, it is stupidity to complain of whatever in her past has so developed her as to make her the object of love. I did not remember having ever delivered that more or less favorite lecture of mine to him. I have no use for women, but I have less for men that pry and meddle and jealously snoop around a woman's past, and I am likely to say so and tell why if somebody touches that particular button in conversation. So Dick did know that Vera had specters lurking in the years behind her. Blackmail would not be very profitable in Vera's case if she became aware of that. And there must be more to Vera than I thought if she could get and hold the love of a man who knew certain things that the average male takes a pride in never forgiving in a woman. I began to understand, too, why Vera had come to me with such assurance. She knew of my ideas on women's secrets. She reasoned, of course, that I would be sympathetic. I wasn't, but it amounted to the same thing. I was going to help her out, and incidentally get some money into my own pocket. It is a privilege to help friends or even strangers when they deserve it, and it pays. I knew that sooner or later Dick would get around to a remark about doing anything for me. He always came to that at some stage of the conversation. He always said it as if he meant it. But I have an aversion to accepting favors. True, I often do accept them, ask for them at times, occasionally demand them. So when, with his customary appearance of sincerity, he said he would do anything for me, I was waiting for him. Supposing that I asked for the loan of, say, $100,000 for 40 hours. That rather floored him for a second. Then he brought his fist down clatteringly on the table, and almost glaring at me, said, "By blink, you'd get it." A lot of money. Cash, you know. I have a batch of bonds that I can raise money on any time. Then say $50,000 for, 48 hours. How soon? Tomorrow's Friday. Say Saturday morning, not later than 10 o'clock. Cash, you know. You'll get it. And say, I'd like awfully for you to come to the house. Dinner, you know, and meet Vera. I've been trying to get you ever since we were married. 6 months now. Sometime, certainly. Sometime be hanged. How about Saturday night? Saturday will probably be a busy day for me. I'll let you know later. You won't forget, by 10 o'clock. I've something rather pressing in hand. And so it was that I gulled the husband into paying Blackmail to keep from himself secrets that he already knew or at least suspected, and which did not give him the least concern. One must be clever and cannot be squeamish when the livelihood depends on his wits. Venables was scarcely out of sight before I telephoned his wife and made an appointment with her. The impropriety of her former visit was repeated. She came to my apartment. Perhaps she was risking further slander of her name. But whoever takes the trouble to investigate will, I believe, discover that whoever has slanderously linked a woman to my name has later made very thorough apologies to the woman herself. I will do anything that a man should to avoid trouble, but if anybody plucks at my sleeve and asks for it, why, then my generosity is aroused. 5. One of the advantages of living in an eminently respectable apartment is that when a woman drops in, whoever chances to see her is sure to believe that she is only a sister running in for a moment's visit. Respectability certainly has its advantages. I was surprised that I had not previously noticed that in Mrs. Venable's face there were certain strong lines of character, a certain solidity of personality. And after all, she really was not frivolous and fluffy. The thing called beauty in a woman is always meretricious and deceptive. Look at the pretty faces of women on magazine covers. One glance and they are often fascinating pictures. A minute's scrutiny and they seem empty as a broken wine glass. 2. Mrs. Venables apologized with a quaint, half-embarrassed determination to show that she did appreciate her imposition on me, and was deeply thankful that she had, intuitively perhaps from what little Richard had told her, known that I would understand and help her. She was rather a different woman, I suppose largely because she believed I would relieve her from worry. Women are always at a disadvantage when worried, and men when women are not. I remarked that I suppose she was very much in love with her husband. I said it casually, though I looked at her rather intently. She at once showed signs of agitation. A glint of suspicion passed through her eyes. No doubt she had heard of men who took advantage of their friends' wives. Perhaps she had met them. Anyway, she rather hurriedly veiled her cordiality, that is, her frank cordiality, and tried earnestly to convince me that she did love her husband. Oh, I don't know how much. So, having placed her at a disadvantage and definitely on the defensive, I could feel more comfortable. I said that I had investigated, in fact, called on Mr. Spence. He wants $50,000 now, I remarked, and watched closely to see how she would take it. She became breathless. I hastened to assure her, and did not minimize her suspicion of me in doing it either, that I would very easily arrange that little amount for her. "But how can I ever repay you?" she asked anxiously. "Oh," I said carelessly and in a way that caused her suspicions of me to become definite. "That is something you don't need worry about. Money isn't everything in the world. You know, Mrs. Venables, you are a very pretty woman." She was on her feet at once with flushed face. Tensely she stood, but quiet. No sign of hysteria. No loud protests. That's the worst of it. One can't tell anything about how a woman will act. At least I can't. So I need to experiment. "I think," she said quietly, meaningly, honestly, "that I have made a mistake in coming to you. Yes, my life will be ruined, but, sir, one may even have a preference in calamities." Had she made any other kind of an answer, I believed that her life would have been, as she called it, ruined. I would have known that she was not entitled to protection from blackmail. And after all, I did like Dick Venables, and I had lost some of my prejudice against his wife. And of course, as women usually do when I meddle with affairs, she had in one dramatic moment turned the tables on me. I was in the uncomfortable position. I should have let well enough alone. But then one doesn't stare across the green cloth so much as I had done without learning a little something in self-control. Of course I bluffed. I looked at her in mild, uncomprehending surprise. I assured her that I knew she was nervous and overweighted by her trouble, but there was going to be no calamity that I knew of. That I'd made arrangement to pay Spence, or rather to have her pay Spence the money. That to pay out that money really meant less than she could suppose, for her and Dick's happiness was precious to me, and I had merely reflected on how tragic it would be for a woman of her undeniable beauty to fade and wither because a skeleton was ever rattling behind her. "You are a very pretty woman," I repeated, unabashed. "But you won't be if this thing isn't settled soon and definitely. So money isn't everything in the world. And why should I expect the wife of my best friend to worry over a loan that means nothing to me and is doing him and her a service?" I said it sincerely. I said it in such a way that, though she was not entirely convinced, perhaps she did have an embarrassing doubt as to whether or not she had previously misunderstood. She sat down again, but she was watchful. Her ears were alert to catch every shade of an intonation, and she was sure to feel deeply ashamed if it did appear by my subsequent manner that she had previously misjudged me. So, to some extent, we were both on the defensive, and before she left I could see that she did feel she had blundered in blazing up so indignantly. "I am distressed, stupidly nervous, and likely to do and say silly things. You will pardon me, won't you, if I have seemed to misunderstand?" she asked as she was leaving when I had carefully explained all of the details for the payment of the money to Spence. I assumed a vague paternal understanding, a benevolent impersonal attitude, and assured her that I did understand perfectly. 6. Friday afternoon at 3:20, I called upon Mr. Spence. He was expecting me. I doubt if he had slept well the night before. He was disturbed and full of suggestions. He wanted to discuss the matter of paying me that money in advance. I declined to consider the discussion. In fact, I was disagreeable, and when I am disagreeable, I say little or nothing. I make no threats and no gestures. I simply stared at Mr. Spence's red, perspiring face. He had decided not to pay the money. That is, he wanted to make me think he had so decided. I did not know but that he had. Professional blackmailers are cautious, cunning animals. However, he had a yellow heart inside his fat little body. He had taken the precaution of getting the money and having it there in his office in case he could not make other arrangement with me. He tried to bluff, but he really had not played enough poker to understand the finer points of that art. Besides, I did have the uncompromising advantage of not greatly caring whether or not he did pay it. It would be worth something to enlighten Venables, particularly as I knew Venables did not care what evidence Spence might have. Dick was athletic and high-tempered. He would positively enjoy bouncing Spence's fat, rubber-like body up and down on the floor. Mr. Spence again weakened as I started out of the door. He called me back and handed me 25 $1,000 bills. I am very observing about some things. I always scrutinize the backs of cards when a new deck comes into the game. In fact, I can detect and learn the subtlest markings in a very short time, 20 minutes at most, and playing all the while. My eyes, not without long and severe study, have been trained. I glanced through the bills, counting them. They were marked. "Very clever of you, Spence," I said softly. Softly, but a flash of fright appeared and remained on his face. "As soon as you got the money from Mrs. Venables, you could have me arrested, the money traced, and the markings would convict me. The money would be restored to you." I gently tossed the bills back onto his desk and looked at him. He protested almost blubberingly that it was nothing of the kind. I looked at him, shivering and stammering and frightened, and reflected on what fools people in general were to cringe before a blackmailer. He played on the fact that people were afraid. An instant's lack of fear, a moment of defiance on the part of the victim, and he would have revealed himself as a tremulous cur. He first tried to appear surprised that the bills were marked. I said nothing. Then he assured me that he always marked bills of such large denomination. I said nothing. Then he explained that he had merely taken that precaution in case Mrs. Venables did not come in or did not bring $50,000. He said almost whiningly that he had no other way of making sure I was not fleecing him, or wouldn't try to fleece him. He urged me to take the money, assuring me that it would be all right, that if Mrs. Venables came in, it would be all right. "Yes," I said, "I know it will be all right. You sit down there and write as I dictate." Again he wanted to protest, but again he weakened. He wrote and signed a statement to the effect that for services rendered he had paid me $25,000 in $1,000 bills, the numbers of which were so-and-so, and that each bill was privately marked by a dot of red ink in the upper right-hand corner. I folded the strange receipt in my bill book and said, "Now, Mr. Spence, you can do whatever you please about trying to make trouble for me over this money. We could have conducted our business amiably enough if you hadn't been such a suspicious and untrustworthy fellow." I left him with no appearance of anger in my manner. I smiled. I could afford to smile. 7. Saturday morning at 10 minutes after 11 punctually at my suggestion, or rather at my insistence, Mrs. Venables, nervous and veiled, went into the private office of Edward Spence and handed him a package carefully wrapped in strong paper. Mr. Spence was agreeable but also nervous. He was surprised at receiving the money. For one thing, he wanted to get to the bank so as not to have such a sum on his hands over Sunday. And the money was not presented to him in $1,000 bills. Most of them were hundreds, some were 500s, but $1 bills and many 10s and 5s were exasperatingly sandwiched in between the more important denominations. Mrs. Venables had not counted the money. She had not looked at it. I had been at some pains to collect my various denominations, and for two reasons. One of them was the desire to exasperate Mr. Spence and delay him to the point of having to hurry to reach the bank, and the other and more desirable reason was to give the bills an unmistakable bulk. He counted the money. He gave Mrs. Venables her letters and a photograph. I had impressed upon her the necessity of taking time to verify every letter to see that it was her own and that all of them, the 15 that had been mentioned in the original demand for blackmail, were there. As for the photograph, that was less important. It was the photograph of a photograph, so she said, and so far as I knew, that was true, in which case another just like it could be produced. But it was the letters that made the photograph convincing. Without the letters, it would have been embarrassing, distressing, but one could have faced the thing with a charge of fake. She took her time to do as I instructed. then left, going straight off in her motor. Spence, a minute later, rushed for the elevator, his hand clasped tightly against a large lump that showed through his inside coat pocket. He was in a hurry. He bounded out of the elevator and started to leave the building. It happened that as he stepped to the pavement, one Charles Thomas Downey, a clerk, a young man of 22, was leisurely returning from his modest lunch at a drugstore soda fountain. He lived with his mother and contributed to her support. He was quiet and respectable. All of these facts were brought out subsequently in the police court. Oddly enough, at the very moment Spence started from the entrance of the building, a man bumped into Downey and instantly began to fume at Downey in a loud voice and presently slapped Downey in the face, whereupon the respectable clerk, being an American, promptly planted his fist in the face of the arrogant young man, neatly dressed and also respectable-looking, who had insulted him. The street was filled with people. In an instant, those about paused, and others hurried up. There was a fight, and people always want to see a fight. There was shuffling and jamming and shoving. Spence, though in a hurry, paused. For one thing, he was not too incurious to give a glance to see what it was all about, and for another, he was rather hemmed in by the crowd. Someone came roughly against him from behind. He was angrily shoved back by the party in front. At once, a party at the side seemed to resent Mr. Spence's sudden movements and gave him a hard shove, at which he tripped over the foot of somebody and nearly fell. In fact, he would have fallen had not a slender, well-dressed, red-headed man protectively caught him. But there was more jostling and shoving, and when Mr. Spence had quite regained his balance, he thanked the red-haired man, who continued to stand by him, and gave another look toward the center of the crowd, where a policeman had the 2 peace-breakers in his hands. Then Mr. Spence, remembering, clutched at his breast, turned pale, scanned the pavement at his feet, looked suspiciously around, and nearly fainted. A block away, I was waiting in the lobby of a hotel. A young man came in and handed me a small parcel and went out. Eel McGuire, in the shuffle which had been staged for Spence's benefit, had easily removed the package and slipped it to a Confederate, who promptly brought it to me. Another Confederate had previously picked a fight with Downey, because Downey was the convenient person, as Spence came from the elevator. Downey and his assailant were later both fined in police court. I paid the fines of both in a rather roundabout way. Downey never knew that he had been one of the principals in staging a scene for the cleverest gang of pickpockets in the country. So Venable's loan was returned to me, having been out of my hands less than 2 hours. In fact, it had been out of his hands less than 2 hours. The reason I had insisted on Spence's paying me in advance was because I could not have profited in any other way. I needed money, but as I sat there in the lobby meditatively reviewing the whole situation and circumstances, I felt dissatisfied. That $25,000 had been made of the blood and sweat of Spence's victims. True, it was something to have deprived him of it. I am not sentimental. I am not squeamish. I am perhaps a bit cruel at times, and one who makes a living as I have had to make mine must keep his heart calloused. Too, I was rather hard-pressed for money just at that moment. But at that, one can usually squeeze through even when pinched. And there is something about blackmail and money that has passed through the hands of a blackmailer that is offensive. It had not seemed so offensive in perspective, not nearly so offensive as the idea of shooting a man in the back for the chance of picking his pockets, but between that and participating in the profits of blackmail, I think I could come nearer to restoring my self-respect by evading the blackmail. Anyway, the Soldiers' Tobacco Fund got an astoundingly large anonymous donation, $24,000 and some dollars, for I deducted what I thought would be enough to pay the police court fines of Downey and his assailant and make a little present to McGuire. Neither McGuire nor any of his boys would hear of it. McGuire said, "Well, we need the practice anyway. And besides, though no names were mentioned, I know who the fellow was that wired bail for me to St. Louis last winter, and also said, beat it. Besides," he added with a little gesture of repugnance, "Spence is a filthy snake." But to return to that Saturday afternoon, I telephoned Venables and reminded him that he had invited me to dinner and that I was coming. Mrs. Venables and I carried off quite easily the formality of being introduced. She was happy and more beautiful, but she came near fainting when I handed to her husband the identical package she had given Spence. "There's the money I borrowed," I said. And ignoring her, I went on to tell that I had been having an experience with a blackmailer. I knew she was trembling fearfully. I could feel her eyes anxiously staring at me, hoping to catch my glance and beg me with a shake of her head to keep silence. But I felt like talking a bit. Besides, I had a little something I wanted to explain to Venables, a series of pictures. "You may not know it," I said, taking out my pictures and undoing the string, "but blackmailers seem to do a rather thriving business through faked photographs. The fellow I have in mind asked $50,000. That is why I borrowed it in a hurry. Look here, this is the original." I extended a picture of myself genteelly leaning against and encircling a chased ionic column with my right arm. "Here," I explained, "is what an artist did with a copy of the original." A grinning woman, lightly dressed, had been pasted over the column, and by painting the column out and adding certain touches, my arm seems to have been around her. "But here," I said, "is the finished product. It would fool anyone but an expert, or at least a very close observer. The third photograph was a photograph of the second, of the fake itself, and had the appearance of having been the original. Such is the way in which the camera can lie. In a similar but more pardonable way, it lies for newspapers every day of the year and enables them to present perfectly proper and highly interesting pictures. Now that I have no further use for these, and I toss them into the fireplace. But I thought you might be interested to see how it was done. You may some day have to explain to your wife how you came to be in a picture with an arm around a strange woman. Millionaires, you know, are fair game for blackmail." He laughed heartily and put his arm about Mrs. Venables. Her eyes, wonderfully expressive, told me of the depths of her gratitude. She understood why I had taken such pains to bring the photographs, but she did not know that I rather feared Spence, enraged by the loss of $75,000, would try to extort something more out of another copy of the photograph. She was also puzzled as to how I regained the money. She was not nearly so puzzled as Venables, who believed that I was not of the temper to pay blackmail to anybody. It obviously pained him to think that I, who had done so many things that he called bold, should have even thought of paying blackmail. "You didn't pay the fellow anything?" he asked anxiously. "I wouldn't have given a blackmailer a blank penny." "No," I said quietly, enigmatically. "There are circumstances and other circumstances. The money was paid to this fellow, but he promptly gave it up, and I don't think he will care to bother with me again." At that, dinner was announced, and Mrs. Venables, pushing Dick aside playfully, carried me off on her arm. For a moment her hand slipped against mine, and she pressed it gently but said nothing. And from that day to this she has called me her best friend, which is just like a woman. In spite of prejudices and principles, of which I have many, she can make me like her. I am delighted to be really considered her best friend. End of Section 3. And end of The Early Adventures of Don Everhard by Gordon Young.